They call them our guardians, saints wrapped in armor, the regime's perfect answer to fear. People cheer when they arrive. People kneel. People whisper prayers into oil smoke and say, "Now we'll be safe." I used to believe that too. Then I started following the aftermath. I have stepped over the silence they leave behind. I have stood in alleys that still smelled of scorched stone and disinfectant, where the only thing moving was the ash. I have watched grieving families search for names that never appear on any list, and I learned the truth no sermon once spoken aloud. The nightmare isn't that they might snap. The nightmare is that they never do. My name is Rix Vaughn. For 37 years I've served in the records ministry, one of those invisible departments that keeps the Empire's wars tidy on paper. Officially, I'm a discrepancy auditor. Unofficially, I'm what people call when the shooting stops, the one who counts what's left. I reconcile projections with reality. I match ammunition allocations to confirmed outcomes. I make sure every death lands in the correct column, so the machine can keep turning without ever admitting it chews. It's a quiet profession, performed under flickering lumen strips in rooms without windows. Paper never cries. Numbers never argue. But if you stare long enough, you can hear what's missing. I've filed reports for mass casualty events that spanned continents. I've calculated bombardment efficiency in lives per minute. I've reduced entire communities to footnotes that no one will ever read twice. Not because I enjoy it, because the system requires it. Because order, we're told, is the only thing standing between humanity and the void. So when the assignment for Terce Majoris arrived, I expected routine. The briefing slate showed up with my morning ration wafer and a cup of recaf so bitter it felt like punishment. Standard format, standard seals, standard confidence. Terce Majoris, a secondary industrial world in the van sector. 14 million registered citizens across 3 hive complexes and a scatter of satellite settlements. Recent compliance correction conducted by elite legionary assets, the Tempest Wardens, after sedition was discovered inside the planetary governor's own administration. Collateral estimates. Negligible. Acceptable. Within doctrine. My task, verify. Confirm that the reported casualties matched expenditure logs and witness summaries. Ensure the final numbers aligned with policy and necessity. Close the file. Move on. I had audited legionary actions before. Their operations were usually clean in the way a scalpel is clean. Swift, targeted, efficient. Compared to the blunt instruments of mass infantry or indiscriminate shelling, these warriors were precision-made flesh. They were deployed when everything else had failed, or when the leadership wanted a problem erased so thoroughly that no one else was trusted to do it. I'd seen the approved footage in communal halls, armored giants walking through fire with calm inevitability as if bullets were weather. I believed in them the way you believe in gravity, as a foundational law of life. The transit to Terce Majoris took 19 days aboard a cargo hauler that smelled like sweat, recycled air, and resignation. I spent the voyage building my audit framework, skimming after-action summaries that read like instruction manuals. Everything was perfect on paper. The sedition network had been mapped. Leaders identified. A single squad deployed. 10 warriors under a sergeant whose identity was conveniently withheld in my files. The action began at local midnight. Duration, 4 hours, 17 minutes. Result, total neutralization of targeted cells. Minimal civilian impact. Infrastructure intact. Secondary objectives met early. It was the kind of report they'd cite in training programs as an ideal. Then I reached Tertium Prime, the main hive on Terce Majoris. And the city itself contradicted the slate. Tertium Prime rose from the rust-colored plains like a monument to stubborn survival. Stacked levels of steel and ferrocrete, miles of layered habitation, 7 million lives packed into vertical streets and buried corridors. The sedition, the report said, operated in mid-level residential blocks, HAB Zones 94 through 108. An area that should have been crowded with workers, vendors, shrine keepers, and the endless flow of people that keeps a hive alive. I expected scorch marks, broken door frames, a few collapsed walkways where heavy fire had done its work. Instead, I found absence. HAB Block 990 was simply not there. Not damaged, not burned, not collapsed. Gone. Where it should have stood was open air and a geometric gap in the skyline that made my stomach tighten with the wrongness of it. The structures on either side remained upright and unscarred, their surfaces too clean. No blast fractures, no fire spidering, no shrapnel pitting. It looked less like destruction and more like removal, as if an immense hand had reached into the city and lifted a single piece straight out, leaving everything around it untouched. The streets that once led to its entrances ended at abrupt drop-offs. Temporary barriers blocked the edges. Hazard sigils glared from metal placards. Local enforcers held the cordon, polite, tense, and careful not to meet my gaze. I asked where the residents had gone. The enforcer nearest me was a woman with sun-cured skin and a tired posture, her rifle hugged to her chest like something holy. She said she didn't know. She'd been assigned to the cordon weeks after the operation and told only that the area was sealed pending investigation. She didn't know what happened to the building. She didn't know what happened to the people. She didn't know anything. And the way she said it, flat, practiced, told me she'd been instructed not to know. Ignorance as policy, ignorance as armor. Back in the archives, I pulled architectural schematics and residency rolls. HAB Block 97 housed roughly 4,000 registered residents, mid-tier labor assigned to manufactories producing power cells and armor components. According to the squad's official report, the structure suffered minimal damage, and fewer than 30 collateral deaths occurred during the extraction of one barricaded cell leader. Minimal. Fewer than 30. And yet the building was missing, and 4,000 names had evaporated with it. That was the first time unease slipped under my ribs. Over the next week, I walked the lanes and ramps the squad supposedly cleared. I traced access corridors, checked med facility intake logs, interviewed survivors who stared past me as if I were a ghost, and compared the warden's expenditure records to the official body counts. The numbers refused to behave. The listed fatalities for the entire compliance action: 412. Seditionists and a handful of civilians caught in incidental crossfire. But when I counted missing ration chits, unclaimed work assignments, family registry entries that never updated, and citizen IDs that abruptly ceased to appear in transit records, the figure climbed. Quietly, steadily, toward something closer to 12,000. Whole family lines simply stopped. Entire residential tiers stood unnaturally untouched. Doors sealed with wax stamps carrying inquisitorial marks. Interiors emptied of everything that makes a place lived in. Furniture gone. Personal effects gone. Even small signs, scratches on walls, handprints on door frames, scrubbed away as if someone had taken offense at the idea of memory. I found a school with desks aligned in perfect rows and no children. I found a shrine where votive candles still burned, their flames steady in recycled air, while the congregation had vanished. A lone maintenance servitor shuffled in endless loops, sweeping a clean floor that didn't need sweeping. When I requested formal witness testimony, I was informed the statements were classified. When I requested full med facility records, entire sections arrived blacked out, leaving summaries so vague they might as well have been prayers. When I requested the communication logs from the night of the operation, I was told the recordings had been corrupted by atmospheric interference. I laughed at that, quietly, into my sleeve, because the equipment on a hive world is built to survive storms, plasma surges, and civil unrest. Interference is an excuse used when someone wants you to stop asking. Someone was pruning reality until it fit the official story. And they were doing it with resources that felt larger than local politics. I returned to my assigned quarters, an administratum cell that smelled of damp walls and old panic, and spent the night arranging my findings like a mosaic. Gaps, silences, absences that repeated in patterns. I am trained to read patterns. What I couldn't understand was the motive. The seditionists were dead. The governor remained in power. The world was compliant. Why erase the true cost if the objective had been achieved? Unless the cost was the real message. I decided to chase the comms logs myself. The Records Ministry keeps redundant archives of all communication traffic, a paranoia inherited from ancient rebellions when corrupted messages were used to fracture loyal forces. Even if primary storage had been scrubbed, copies should exist in neglected tertiary systems. Forgotten vaults, old nodes, deep storage no one bothers to maintain until someone like me comes looking. I spent 2 days navigating Tertium Prime's bureaucracy, filing requests in triplicate, citing archaic regulations, calling in favors from colleagues who owed me for past audits. I followed the paper trail down into a sub-level so deep the air tasted like rust, and the lights stuttered like they were afraid to stay on. That's where I found the truth. The logs weren't corrupted. They were edited. You could see it in the waveform cuts, the unnatural jumps, the missing segments stitched together with the cold neatness of a blade. Whoever did it removed chunks so carefully that casual review would accept the lie. But they made one mistake. They left the timestamps intact, and that meant I could measure exactly how much had been removed. The operation lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. The preserved traffic totaled 41 minutes. 3.5 hours had been carved out. I played what remained. The first voice was calm, almost bored. Crisp command diction, the kind you hear from people who consider outcomes inevitable. Contact established, entering HAB Zone 94. Resistance minimal. It sounded like a report written after the fact, like he was narrating something already finished. Background noise suggested movement, distant impacts, muffled pops, the low industrial groan of a sleeping hive. The voice continued, marking progress with methodical certainty. Floors cleared, rooms secured, targets neutralized. Then a sudden gap. When the recording resumed, the tone hadn't changed, only the content. Civilian concentration point Alpha secured, approximately 400 units. Requesting guidance on disposition. Units. Not citizens, not people. Units. There was a pause, waiting, listening, then the same voice again. Acknowledged. Proceeding with protocol TERT. Estimated completion, 30 minutes. Another cut, a longer one. And when sound returned, there was only screaming. 11 seconds, that was all. But in those 11 seconds, I heard more honest terror than I'd heard in decades of war reports. It wasn't the chaos of accidental crossfire. It wasn't the panic of people fleeing danger. It was the sound you make when you understand there will be no mercy, no misunderstanding, no escape, when the end is not possible but certain. Then silence. I sat in that archive chamber for a long time after the playback ended, staring at my slate as if it had become something alive. I tried to force my mind back into safe logic. They are defenders, not monsters. They protect us from worse things. But the recording wouldn't let me pretend. So I went looking for visual feeds. Tertium Prime had surveillance on every main thoroughfare. Thousands of street capture units feeding central monitoring stations where mind-wiped attendants watched for unrest. The retention cycle was 90 days. The night of the operation should still have been there. I filed the requests, cited my authority, waited, denied. The denial came from an office so obscure it took me half a day to confirm it existed. The Order of Selective Archival Maintenance, an inquisitorial administrative branch tasked with deciding which records were necessary for continuity and which were harmful to stability. The message was courteous and absolute. The relevant feeds had been transferred into inquisitorial custody. My clearance did not apply. Further attempts would be noted. Disciplinary action, including termination of service, was possible. Stop looking. But I have spent a lifetime learning that the strongest no often marks the strongest yes. If they seized the feeds, something in them mattered. and if something mattered, there was a chance they missed a copy. Redundancy is the Empire's oldest habit. 3 days later, I found it in the last place I expected, the Cathedral Network. The local faith apparatus ran its own capture units to manage pilgrim flow and ensure proper observance. Their storage was local. Old hardware, old habits, old routines no inquisitorial clerk had bothered to purge. The priests were elderly and uninterested. I presented my request as routine verification for a compliance report. They waved me toward the archive chambers with the weary indifference of people who have decided the material world is already lost. The recordings were stored on ancient cylinders that had to be played on machines that clicked and wheezed like sick animals. I loaded the cylinder for the night in question. The footage began in grainy monochrome, a plaza near Hab Zone 96. Litter on the ground, ration tins, scraps of parchment, drifting debris. A few pedestrians crossed the frame, hunched and slow, moving like people whose bodies belonged to shift schedules. For a long while, nothing happened. Then they arrived. 10 figures in heavy armor, too large for the street to feel real around them. Even through the degraded quality, they were unmistakable. The way they carried their weapons, the way their silhouettes moved with controlled weight, the way the space seemed to shrink in their presence. Their colors read as dark and pale in the footage, but I knew the heraldry from the file. Blue and silver, Tempest Wardens. At the front walked the sergeant, a fraction taller, his armor adorned with marks that meant something to someone above my pay grade. What struck me most was not their size. It was their pace. They did not rush. They did not move like responders to an urgent threat. They walked like owners returning to property. When they reached the Hab entrance, the sergeant raised a fist. The entire squad halted, perfectly, simultaneously, like machinery receiving a single command. He turned to them. I couldn't hear his words, but I watched their reactions. Small, efficient movements, checks performed with ritual confidence, the calm choreography of predators who have never needed to doubt the outcome. Then they entered. The camera showed an empty street. Minutes ticked by. Nothing in the environment reflected a battle happening inside. No running crowds, no smoke spilling out, no frantic enforcers. The hive remained still. Then the screaming began. At first it was faint, muffled through walls and audio decay, but unmistakable. It built, multiplied, layered into a chorus of terror that made my skin prickle. The camera couldn't see inside, but the sound filled the space like a shadow spreading. Between waves of voices, other noises punctuated the air, sharp, percussive bursts, heavy impacts. Sounds that suggested method, not chaos. I forced myself to keep watching. After 43 minutes, the squad emerged. They walked with the same measured certainty they'd shown when they arrived. Their armor bore dark streaks that the monochrome image rendered as near black. The sergeant paused at the threshold and looked back into the Hab as if evaluating a completed task. He gave a small nod, satisfaction, approval, something like that, and raised his hand again. The squad reformed and moved away, leaving the building behind as if it were empty already. I advanced the footage, waiting for survivors, for med teams, for enforcers, for anything that would make the screaming feel like a misunderstanding. No one came. The Hab remained dark and still. And as the recorded dawn brightened, I saw something that made my hands shake. The windows were stained red, not in random splashes, not in chaotic smears, evenly, uniformly. Every pane coated as if someone had taken time, careful time, to ensure the same mark appeared across the entire facade. It didn't look like the aftermath of a fight. It looked like a message, a demonstration. I spent the next week searching for someone who would speak plainly. Most survivors I'd interviewed gave the same cautious praise. Swift action, decisive correction, gratitude to the Guardians. Their words sounded rehearsed, their eyes fixed on a point behind my shoulder. But for every person willing to repeat the approved narrative, there were others who refused to speak at all. I found one of the silent ones in the lower hive. Her name was Cetra. Before the compliance action, she supervised a manufactorum shift. Now she sorted scrap in a facility that paid in meal chits and exhaustion. When I approached, she stared at me with the hollow focus of someone still living inside a memory. She didn't want to talk. I told her I wasn't there to threaten her. I said I wanted a true accounting, not the polished version meant for public morale. I said truth mattered. She laughed, short, sharp, brittle, and told me the Empire doesn't care about truth, only obedience. Then anyway, she spoke. She said the first sign wasn't gunfire. It was smell. She'd been preparing to sleep, washing in the communal facilities when the air changed. An edge of ozone, burnt metal, and fuel that didn't belong to normal hive life. The scent grew stronger until she recognized it as the signature of armored giants. Heat-treated plating and propellant, the kind of smell that announces power. Then the building vox crackled alive. A voice she didn't recognize ordered all residents to move to the central atrium at ground level immediately. No reason, no context, only certainty. Cetra hesitated, confused, frightened by the strangeness of it. Then she heard the measured weight of armored steps in the corridor outside her quarters. Hesitation ended. She joined the flow of residents moving toward the stairs, parents carrying children, elders clutching sticks, workers still in grime-stained uniforms. No one spoke. The silence felt enforced by instinct, as if every person there sensed that resistance would not be punished. It would be erased. When she reached the atrium, it was packed. Bodies pressed together, breath thick, temperature rising despite the ventilation. Around the perimeter stood the 10 armored figures, spaced like pillars. Weapons held ready but not pointed at any single person. They did not shout. They simply watched. And in their stillness, Cetra said, there was a pressure that made her mind scream to run, even while her body understood it was impossible. Then the sergeant stepped forward. He removed his helmet. Cetra described his face as too perfect to feel human, youthful, sculpted, calm, with eyes that carried a depth she couldn't explain, like he'd seen things that should break a person and had decided not to break. When he spoke, his voice filled the atrium without effort. Clear, resonant, final. And the words he said made her understand that everyone in that room had already been judged. He told them the building had harbored sedition, that the guilty had been identified and eliminated, that the corruption had been cut out. But, he said, ideas spread, doubt spreads, fear spreads, and the Empire could not afford even the smallest chance that infection might remain. So they were being given a choice. Anyone who had felt doubt, and anyone who had listened, even briefly, to forbidden whispers, was invited to step forward and confess. Confession, he promised, would be treated as repentance. Those who admitted weakness would be separated for corrective service and offered a path to redemption through absolute obedience. Those who remained silent would be assumed pure, and once the verification was complete, they would be allowed to return to their quarters. Cetra said the atrium stayed silent, not because everyone was innocent, because everyone understood that the choice wasn't a choice at all. Cetra told me she knew it was false the instant the sergeant called it a choice. Not because she was clever, she said, because she could feel it. Something in the man's gaze wasn't bargaining, wasn't mercy, wasn't even judgment in the human sense. It was categorization. A cold, finished certainty, like a clerk stamping a form that had already been approved. Still, people stepped forward. Some sobbed openly, hands shaking as they confessed to thoughts they barely understood. Others stared ahead with the stiff posture of the desperate, trying to look brave in front of their children. A few said nothing at all, only moved, as if their bodies were obeying their fear. They weren't confessing because they believed. They were confessing because hope is the last reflex of the trapped. The armored giants directed the confessors to one side of the atrium, not with words were for humans, but with the slight tilt of weapons, the smallest angles of the threat. The confessors clumped together, packed tighter as minutes passed, a living bundle of trembling breath. When no more hands rose, when no more voices broke, the sergeant gave a small nod. He replaced his helmet. And then the illusion ended. What happened next came so fast, Cetra's mind refused it at first, filed it under this can't be real. The warriors opened fire, not at the confessors, at the crowd that had stayed silent, at those who had clung to the idea that innocence was a shield. Explosive gunfire hammered the atrium with mechanical rhythm, a sustained thunder that swallowed individual screams. Cetra said it felt like the air itself was being punched. People tried to run, but the squad had already arranged themselves with deliberate geometry, angles and arcs that left no clean exit, no safe pocket, no direction that wasn't watched. It wasn't chaos. It was design. Cetra threw herself behind a decorative pillar, pressing into the cold stone until her ribs hurt. She prayed. Not out of faith, she said, but out of reflex, the way drowning people grab at anything solid. Around her, bodies fell in numbers too large for her mind to count, the noise of impacts blending into one continuous horror. She kept her mouth closed so she wouldn't cry out and give herself away. It lasted only moments, but in memory, it stretched until time felt broken. When the firing stopped, Cetra stayed frozen. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She waited for the world to restart and for it to have all been a nightmare. Instead, she heard movement, heavy steps, measured, unhurried. The same calm pace the squad had shown when they first arrived. They walked among the fallen with the patience of workers finishing a task. Cetra could not see everything from her hiding place, but she heard enough. Short movements, pauses, the faint scrape of metal against stone. The rhythm told her what it meant. They were checking, ensuring, completing. Then the sergeant spoke again, his voice amplified, steady, as if addressing a classroom. He thanked the confessors for their honesty. He told them their names had been recorded and would be passed to the appropriate authorities for evaluation. Until transport arrived, they were to remain where they were, under supervision, ready for transfer to a penitent facility where they could redeem themselves through service. The confessors nodded, not because they trusted him, but because they were surrounded by the dead, and obedience was the only motion left that didn't feel like suicide. Cetra watched as the armored giants began arranging the bodies. Not in frantic panic, not in disgust, not even in haste, just in neat lines, like inventory. The atrium transformed from a place of gathering into something that resembled a processing bay. The work was silent. Each warrior moved as if he already knew his portion of the labor. When the floor was orderly again, when the horror had been made tidy, the sergeant walked among the confessors. He examined them one by one. Sometimes he paused. Sometimes a small device in his gauntlet flashed faintly. He would mark an individual without a word and move on. Then he gestured. The squad separated the marked from the unmarked with quick, practiced efficiency. The unmarked, around 100, Cetra estimated, were directed toward the main exit, told to return to their quarters, told to continue their lives, told in effect that they had been forgiven. They ran, not in celebration, more like animals released from a snare. They fled the atrium as if the air inside it was poison, as if staying 1 second longer might reverse their fortune. Cetra felt something dangerous rise inside her then. Hope. The foolish, automatic thought that maybe the killing had ended and the survivors would be allowed to live. Then the sergeant raised his hand again. The squad turned their weapons on the marked confessors. This time, there was no pretense, no ceremony, just fast, clinical gunfire. The marked group barely had time to understand what was happening before the moment was over. When the silence returned, the atrium held only corpses, armor, and the smell of fear turning stale. Cetra pressed herself tighter into the shadow behind the pillar and begged whatever powers existed, holy or indifferent, not to let them notice the one survivor they had missed. She stayed there until the footsteps receded, until the armored weight moved away into distant corridors, until the hum of the building felt empty again. Only then did she crawl out. She moved like someone learning to walk, She didn't look at faces. She didn't look at hands. She couldn't. The floor was slick in places, and she kept her eyes on the stone and the seams between tiles, focusing on anything that wasn't human. It took her hours to find a path upward that didn't cross the squad's patrol. She listened for every sound, flinched at every vibration, and kept expecting the helmeted silhouette of a giant to appear at the end of a corridor like a judgment walking on two legs. When she finally reached the outside in the weak dawn light, her body revolted. She retched until there was nothing left but pain. She went to the nearest enforcer station and tried to report what she'd seen. The enforcers didn't look shocked. They looked tired. They told her, gently, that all testimony regarding the compliance action had to be filed through official channels, that it would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities, that she should go home and rest. Cetra never filed anything. When I asked her why, she looked at me as if I were a child asking why you can't drink poison, because she understood then what the action really was. Not a raid against sedition, a lesson, a test. A brutal method of measuring a population, not by devotion, but by fear response. A demonstration that made obedience instinctive, a formula designed to leave just enough survivors carrying just enough terror to infect an entire hive with the correct behavior. They had offered confession and silence, and they had killed people in both categories, proving in the simplest possible language that guilt and innocence were irrelevant. Only usefulness mattered. Only compliance mattered. The unmarked who were released would spread the story, not as an organized warning, not as a rebellion, but as a whispered survival rule. When they arrive, do exactly what you're told. Immediately, completely. No questions. No hesitation. Fear became policy without needing paperwork. Cetra finished her story and stared at me with a gaze so exhausted it barely held anger. She said the squad hadn't panicked, they hadn't lost control, they hadn't made mistakes. They had executed a procedure. And the number of deaths, how many, how fast, who lived long enough to remember, was part of that procedure. I asked her how she survived. She shook her head. Maybe they missed her. Maybe the shadow behind the pillar was enough. Or maybe, she said, and her voice nearly failed on the words, maybe they let her live on purpose, because one witness is sometimes more effective than any official proclamation. I thanked her. I told her I would record what she'd said. She laughed, small, sharp, bitter, and told me I was a fool if I believed the Empire would ever allow that version of events to become official. I returned to my quarters and stared at my slate until the lumen strip buzzed itself into my skull. For decades I had carried a clean, comforting image of those warriors, defenders against the galaxy's nightmares, a wall between humanity and extinction. But the evidence left no room for comfort. Edited communications, seized footage, sealed doors, missing families, a building that had ceased to exist, and a survivor describing not a battle, but a controlled harvest of fear. They were not protectors who sometimes did ugly things. They were an enforcement instrument, deployed to keep worlds useful. I began assembling my final audit anyway, because I am what I am. A person trained to make reality fit into columns and trained against all wisdom to believe columns should reflect reality. I documented every discrepancy, every sealed block, every absence that repeated. I included Cetra's account. I included transcripts of the surviving comms fragments and still images from the cathedral feeds, enough to show presence, timing, and pattern. I recalculated the casualty count. 412 was a lie. The true figure was an order of magnitude higher, and more important than the number itself was the shape of it. The deaths were not accidental. They were not collateral. They were the point. A cull calibrated to terrify without breaking productivity. Kill too few, and the lesson fades into rumor. Kill too many, and the manufactories stall, and the world becomes a corpse that can't pay its tithe. But kill the right number, in the right place, witnessed by the right survivors, and fear becomes self-sustaining. The mathematics became simple once I stopped letting my mind label the dead as neighbors and started seeing them the way the Empire insists we see them, as variables in a system balancing output against obedience. I submitted the report to Central Processing on Tertium Prime and waited for the response I already knew was coming. It arrived the same day, carried not through ordinary channels, but sealed with inquisitorial authority. The message was brief, clinical, polite. My report had been reviewed and found to contain inaccuracies and unsupported assertions inconsistent with verified sources. I was instructed to amend my findings to match the official casualty figure. I was reminded that my duty was accuracy in service of Imperial stability, not truth for its own sake. Then it presented me with a choice. I could revise and continue my work, or I could refuse and accept consequences. Dismissal, confiscation, and inquisitorial review of my loyalty. Comply or die, the same false generosity that had been offered in that atrium. I spent 3 days walking Tertium Prime before I answered. I watched the way people moved, heads lowered, conversations shortened, crowds dissolving before they formed. I watched how eyes flicked toward the sky at sudden noise, how hands tightened on ration bags, how silence became the safest habit. Fear had soaked into the hive like oil into cloth. And I thought about Cetra's laugh. The way she said the Empire doesn't care about truth, only obedience. In the end, I amended my report. I replaced the real number with the approved number. I removed mention of the cathedral feeds. I deleted Cetra's testimony. I rewrote the conclusion in the acceptable language of duty and precision and regrettable but permissible loss. I submitted the amended version. It was accepted within the hour. My record remained clean. My service continued. I was commended for diligence and assigned to the next audit on a world whose name I barely bothered to memorize. And then I did the only thing that let me sleep at all. I kept copies, the original transcripts, the calculations, the witness account, the fragments of footage, all of it stored on small data wafers hidden where even inquisitorial clerks rarely bothered to look. Not because I believed in heroic rebellion, but because I needed to believe the truth could survive somewhere, even if it could not breathe. I told myself I was preserving evidence for a future reckoning. I do not believe that day will ever come. But I needed the lie, the private lie that I had not completely surrendered. So I returned to my work, counting the dead for an empire that measures corpses in percentages and calls slaughter acceptable as long as it keeps the machine running. And I still think about Terce Majoris in the quiet gaps between assignments, when my mind drifts and my defenses weaken. I think about the sergeant's voice turning confession into a weapon. I think about how carefully the survivors were chosen. I think about what it meant that when my own false choice arrived, I chose compliance over truth. Not because I believed, but because I was afraid. I tell myself I'm being strategic, that by staying alive inside the system, I can keep documenting what it does. That maybe one day I can smuggle something meaningful into the hands of someone who can act. But I know that's another comfort story. The real truth is simpler. I'm afraid of becoming a number in someone else's ledger. Afraid of being reduced to acceptable loss in service of a calculation I will never be permitted to see. The warriors are not monsters. That is the detail that makes my stomach feel heavy. Monsters are chaotic. Monsters are impulsive. Monsters are broken in ways that make their violence comprehensible. Those warriors were not broken. They were functioning. They were executing protocols written by minds that understand human behavior as clearly as they understand ballistics. They did not lose control. They did not hesitate. They did not kill more than required or less than necessary. They calculated the cost and paid it without pause. That is what makes them terrifying. Not their strength, not their weapons, not the impossible armor. Their certainty. The absolute conviction that whatever they do is justified because it serves the machine. They do not lie awake wondering if there was another way. They simply move on to the next world, the next block, the next crowd that needs to be sorted into categories: useful, redeemable, expendable. And the system fears them not because they might betray it, but because they work. Because worlds that experience that kind of compliance do not rebel for generations. The fear becomes inheritance, passed from parent to child as whispered rules about the angels who punish hesitation. The terrible part is that the galaxy is not gentle. I have audited enough battlefields to know the threats are real. Maybe the Empire's cruelty is a response to horrors that would devour us otherwise. Maybe those warriors are necessary. Maybe this is the price of survival. But I will die knowing what we paid. And I will die knowing I helped hide the receipt. I am Rix Vaughn, lost documentation specialist, servant of the Records Ministry for 37 years. And I am afraid, not only of the armored giants, not only of the Inquisitors, but of what happens when fear becomes normal. Of the day I can change a death toll and feel nothing at all. Because perhaps that is the final purpose of the machine. Not only to enforce obedience, but to reshape the souls of the obedient until they can participate in atrocity and call it duty. The warriors are always coming. To some world, some sector, some block with a problem the Empire wants solved. They will do what they were made to do with perfect efficiency, and people like me will count the dead, adjust the figures, and make the paperwork clean enough that no one has to look too closely. That is how terrifying a space marine truly is, not because of what they are, but because of what they make the rest of us become.